It's 3:39 in the morning. That hour exists in a strange space. Too late to be awake on purpose and too early to start your day. That's when a 911 call came in. A house was on fire, fully engulfed. And the caller believed the people who lived there were still inside. By the time firefighters arrived, the flames had already consumed the home. Inside, two people were gone: Gloria Hart and Lindell Lewis. They were found upstairs in the bathroom. Investigators later determined they were trying to escape, but smoke inhalation overtook them first. This wasn't an accident, and it wouldn't be the last fire. Welcome back to Murder in the Black. I'm Steph. This case isn't only devastating because of the number of lives lost, but because of how close the danger lived and how long it went unchallenged. The first fire was January 18, 2016 at 3:39 a.m. Emergency crews responded to the blaze. The house was fully engulfed. Gloria Hart and Lindell Lewis were found upstairs. The fire marshal immediately noticed suspicious burn patterns on the exterior of the home. Surveillance footage revealed a figure in a jumpsuit igniting the house in multiple locations. A partial view of the assailant's face was visible, but not identifiable. This fire was intentional. Lindell Lewis was known to have shady characters frequenting the home. At one point, his car and the side of his house had been set on fire. He also had people living in his basement at the time, and they had been known to have some shady dealings with some drug dealers that they might have crossed somewhere along the line. And there had been ongoing tension. Now, it was also alleged that Lindell's ex-wife had unresolved issues with him. There was an array of possible suspects that police had to narrow down because there was obviously a lot going on at Lindell's home. Now, one of the first people that they talked to was Stanley Ford. Stanley Ford was a neighbor. He described himself as a watchman of the block. He claimed that he slept during the day and watched the neighborhood at night. He wanted to make sure that his neighborhood was safe. Maybe a notable aspect of someone's character, but maybe a little unusual too. And he spoke repeatedly about Lindell's residence. He claimed that Lindell and Gloria were involved in drug use. They had people that would come over for prostitution services, and even alleged that there was homosexual activity that went on at Lindell's residence. So he had a lot to say to investigators. Now, a lot of people contended that Stanley actually might have been the reason why Lindell's house was set on fire. But they had to figure out if this was just the rumor mill or was there something to it. He was questioned multiple times, and each time he denied any involvement. But investigators overall felt like there was a little more here because as they vetted out the possible persons of interest in Lindell's case, they noticed that they were able to scratch off a lot of those people. And their senses began to heighten as they talked to Stanley and other people of the neighborhood. Now, investigators believed that it could possibly be Stanley Ford in the surveillance footage. But as I mentioned previously, there was no identifiable factors. You couldn't really see the face from the front. You saw a side profile, and that didn't give them much because the perpetrator had a hood on and had the hood tightened by a drawstring. So he made sure that at every angle in that surveillance footage that otherwise would be very helpful, that it wouldn't be helpful at all. And so they couldn't prove that Stanley Ford had any real involvement. And they asked if he was willing to come down and engage in a polygraph test, just so that his name would be completely off the suspect list. but he refused. And with that, they had no reason to bring Stanley Ford or arrest him for that matter. I want to take a moment and talk about arsonist behavior. We often talk here on Murder in the Black about a more conventional way of murder. And arson is a totally different subject. So I want to refresh you if you're a baby true crimer, or if you already know, it's important to just review some things that we know. Now, usually when a person uses a gun, they're trying to create distance physically and emotionally. And so that's not usually what we characterize as a crime of passion. There's efficiency and speed. They want to get it done very quickly, and they want to use a means of power and control. But when somebody uses a knife, we know that that's closeness and intensity. Usually, when somebody uses a knife, they're very close to that person, very physically or emotionally. And it's a symbolic act of violence. It's very personal, right? So that's something that we're used to when we talk about true crime on Murder in the Black. But I want to talk about arsonists because that's not something that we've visited. And I really want you to understand what the perpetrator was thinking. Now, arson rarely begins with tragedy, it begins with permission. Small fires often come first, test of reaction and consequence. In this case, those early warning fires were already present. For instance, remember I told you Lindell already had a fire that took place at his home. On the side of his house was burned and also his car. So that was a small fire. That was the arsonist giving somewhat of a warning, but also testing to see if that would have any reaction. When we talk about an arsonist, they begin with those small fires that was already present in this case. Arsonists typically act close to home. They know routines, they know exits, they know when people are asleep. Multiple ignition points signal intent. Late night timing signals are calculated. Returning to the same area signals escalation. Fire becomes a solution once belief replaces restraint. They didn't have any real leads, and before you know it, a year passes. And on May 15, 2017, 1 year later, the fire returned to the same block. This time, 7 people died. 5 were sadly children. The fire started outside. The home moved quickly. There were no other exits. The victims were overcome by smoke inhalation. The victims were 1 year old Cameron Huggins, Olivia Huggins, 3, Kyle Huggins, 5, Deasia Huggins, 6 years old, Jarrett Boggs, 14, and their father, Dennis Huggins, and mother, Angela Boggs. Dennis and Angela were found covering their children, and one child was found in the stairwell with the family dog. Now, the investigation quickly began. They initially thought this could possibly be an accidental fire. One of the reasons they believe this is because Dennis recently had done a remodel of their home. And I'm talking about a complete remodel from aesthetics all the way down to the electrical wiring. And he had did a lot of the work himself. And so it was easy to believe by family and friends who talked to the fire marshal that maybe he slipped up. Maybe he made a mistake when he was replacing old wiring. However, when they examined the home and the electrical wiring, they didn't notice anything faulty at all. The other reason for concern of an accidental fire was that it was Mother's Day weekend and they recently barbecued. And so they noticed at the entry of the home on the side, there was some charcoals that weren't put out in the right manner. And so they believe that possibly this could have been a way to ignite the home. But after fully vetting both scenarios, an accidental cause was ruled out. Now, this fire was very clearly arson. And one of the first things that investigators did was try to see if Angela or Dennis had any known enemies. Now, Angela and Dennis were an interracial couple. Dennis was Black, Angela was white. And regardless of how we feel about today and how diversity and inclusion is accepted, there are still people that don't believe interracial couples should exist. And so this could be a source of contention, but when they talked through it with family, they really didn't find anything to substantiate this claim. But very quickly, they realized that Angela's ex husband, Patrick Boggs, had an issue with Angela because he previously set Angela on fire and beat her up so severely that he was sent to jail because of the incident. And because their house was set on fire, they felt maybe he had a cause and a reason to come back. I mean, this seemed like behavior from Patrick. They immediately reached Patrick. He was on parole for those charges. And when they met up with him, he was living in Ravenna, Ohio. He had an apartment, and that apartment had surveillance footage outside. So they were able to confirm that he was there. But they looked a little closer. They looked at his phone records, and it showed that he never left Ravenna, Ohio. And he was very quickly eliminated. However, as they began to talk to people in the neighborhood and canvass the area, as they always do, Stanley Ford's name came back into question. And some people in the neighborhood came forward to police and said that Stanley had an issue with the children of the Bog Huggins family, that he claimed that they were going around the neighborhood, breaking off people's rearview mirrors, and just overall being kids. But for him, it was too much. So, police once again asked Stanley to come down for a formal interview just to clear his name, talk about the fire, get any information from him. And Stanley refused. And police felt like they had enough evidence to get a search warrant on Stanley Ford's property. Very quickly, they recovered his tennis shoes, and he had put them out in the trash, but they retrieved them. And on those tennis shoes, they found accelerant residue, which kind of jived with what they were thinking already, that this was their guy. They just needed the evidence. Now, Stanley claimed that during this fire, he was asleep. And he said this in front of his wife. And he said, I was asleep and my wife was right next to me. And his wife kind of looked at him like, what are you talking about? No, you weren't. Like, her face said it. And y'all know how it is when your face tells the story. I said this last week. Very often, especially if everything shows on your face, you don't have a poker face. Well, his wife did not have a poker face. And so the detective noticed it. And she didn't say anything. She didn't confirm or deny his story, but her face denied it. And they paid attention to that. Now, the one thing I want you to know that investigators did after executing this search warrant is they decided that they were going to film the search warrant. Now, I don't know if this is typical or atypical in these cases for the Ohio Police Department who executed the search warrant. However, they had a specific strategy that they wanted to do. They wanted to make sure that the person who was filming them executing the search warrant paid very close attention to Stanley Ford. They wanted to see how Stanley Ford walked, how he walked quickly when he was going to do something, or maybe him walking slowly, or simply just watch his gait and how he moved his arms and the way they swayed. Because it was with that they were going to use that footage to compare it to the surveillance footage that they had in the May 7th fire and also in the January 18th fire of the previous year. Now, they go back to the department and they view the video footage they just took for the search warrant, and they compare it to the surveillance footage they had from both fires. And very quickly, they are convinced that this is Stanley Ford. This is him. The walk was similar, the way he swayed his arms, just all of the defining characteristics of someone's walk was there. And it was Stanley Ford, very clear to them. But they did one better. They got Stanley's wife to come down to the police department because they already knew she knew a little bit more than what she was saying in the first place. And they said, hey, we want you to watch this surveillance footage and tell us if this looks similar or if this is someone that you know. So she said, okay. And she viewed the footage and she hung her head in total exhaustion and said, that is my husband. That's Stanley. This isn't the person I married, because she knew what this meant, that the person terrorizing their neighborhood was her husband. Now, they brought Stanley down for a formal interview, and they talked to him for quite some time. And they asked him, Stanley, let's level with each other. Tell us if you did anything to this family. Did you do anything to Lindell and Gloria? And why would you do it? Did something happen? And very consistently, he said, no, I was not responsible for this. Yes, I am openly admitting that I did not like their presence in the neighborhood. I felt like they were full of debauchery and were hanging out with hoodlums and the kids were doing too much, but I'm not responsible. And so he stayed on that track for quite some time, if I'm being honest. He just denied. But then they told him they had surveillance footage of him walking in the neighborhood at the time of the fires, on both fires, on the one that took place in May and the one that took place in January of the previous year. And very quickly, he started to come off of his story because he admits that, yes, I was walking on the nights of the fires, but I was simply just going out to stretch my legs. I get a jolly horse in my left leg, and I just need to stretch my legs. But I didn't see any fires. And based on the surveillance footage, it just isn't possible that he didn't see any fires. And by this time, they pretty much knew that he was lying anyway. He denied being on camera. He denied anything that would connect him. Stanley Ford was formally charged shortly after his arrest in May 2017, and he never gave any explanation to why he started these fires, what led to these fires. He contended that he was innocent. But a grand jury indicted him on 29 counts related to 3 separate arson incidents, including fires that killed 2 adults in 2016 and the family of 7 in 2017. Now, the charges included multiple counts of aggravated arson and aggravated murder for the 9 deaths, along with additional related felony counts tied to intentionally setting deadly fires in his neighborhood. Stanley Ford's trial in Ohio unfolded over several years due to the pandemic. His initial trial began in March of 2020, but was declared a mistrial in June of 2020 because of concerns about holding a fair trial during the pandemic. A new trial began in early 2021 with opening statements and juror reactions taking place in August of 2021. At trial, jurors visited both homes. Now, I want you to know that the surveillance footage was very damning because they were able to match his walk. His wife was able to confirm that. And also, it didn't hurt that they had those tennis shoes that were found with accelerant. They also had witnesses that came forward to talk about his contention with Lindell and Gloria and also the Boggs Huggins family. But have to understand that the surveillance footage, while damning in some ways, was somewhat troublesome as well. It could be used in the defense's advantage because not one time was Stanley's face seen in full view on the surveillance footage. And they would argue that. But the first defense strategy was to argue that Stanley Ford had a brain disorder. Now, I just told you that he experienced several delays leading up to the trial that took place in 2021. And one of those delays was from Stanley himself. Stanley felt like the defense of a brain disorder just didn't work well for him. And he actually tried to get his defense attorneys fired several times. He felt like he was meeting too much with psychiatrists, taking too many tests, and he felt it was all a wash, that he didn't commit this in the first place, and he didn't want to go with the strategy of a brain disorder. However, after experiencing so many delays and the trial eventually moving forward, he decided to go along with the defense's strategy of a brain disorder. Now, you're saying, Steph, what brain disorder? At the time that Stanley Ford was arrested, he was 58 years old. And according to his health records, in the leading up to the first fire of Lindell and Gloria, he had pneumonia. And they contended that because he had pneumonia, that he was susceptible to having many strokes and or many seizures that were either present, or he didn't have any effects or symptoms of these many strokes or seizures. And as a result, he had a lack of impulse control. And this is what led him to possibly setting these homes on fire. And I also want you to know that the death penalty was on the table. And his defense team knew that if they presented evidence that he had a brain disorder, or a brain disorder was responsible for his behavior, well, there was a better chance that if he was convicted, they could argue to take the death penalty off the table. They also did exactly what I said. They challenged that surveillance footage. Neighbors did come forward and testify about Ford's complaint. And I want you to know his biggest contention with each family. With Lindell and Gloria, he was angry because they had what he deemed as shady characters showing up to their house. They were always on the front porch, loud. They had prostitution and other behaviors that he deemed as lewd. And he just felt overall that they shouldn't be in the neighborhood. Now, with the Boggs Huggins family, he said that their kids were uncontrollable, that they were breaking things in the neighborhood, and they did not have any consequences because of that. And he had beef with them. He wanted to get them out. And remember, I told you, he really felt that he was the watchman of the neighborhood, that he was the person who was responsible for carrying out any type of retribution. If there was any to give out, he was responsible. Now, Detective Looney, who was in charge of both cases, testified about Ford's shifting story and his resentment towards his neighbors. And it was through his testimony that they were able to introduce Patrick Boggs into the scenario. Now, if you remember, Patrick Boggs was Angela's ex-husband who set her on fire. Now, Detective Looney was able to say that he did not believe that it was Patrick Boggs, that they had vetted him, that they checked out his alibi, and that he was in Ravenel, Ohio at the time of the fires. But because of this introduction, then the defense was able to introduce Patrick Boggs as a witness. So they bring him on the stand, and he immediately says that he wants to invoke his Fifth Amendment right. He doesn't want to say anything, basically meaning that if he says anything, it could possibly incriminate him in this case. And that gave the jury a sense that maybe Patrick Boggs did have something to do with it, because it was through Detective Looney that they were able to hear that Patrick Boggs had set Angela on fire, and he was a suspect initially. And when Patrick got on the stand and said, well, I invoke my Fifth Amendment right, I don't want to talk, it could possibly incriminate me in this trial, well, that gave a reason for pause. And that's the defense's strategy. They want to bring into question somebody else did it other than my client. And that's exactly what they did. Now, at the end of Stanley Ford's trial, the jury found him guilty on 26 of the 29 counts, including 9 counts of aggravated murder, one for each victim killed in the 2016 and 2017 Akron arson fires, along with multiple counts of aggravated arson and related fire-setting offenses. Although the death penalty was considered, The jury ultimately rejected it and recommended a life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Now, let me tell you how close this was. Out of 12 jurors, 11 voted that he should receive the death penalty. Just one decided that he shouldn't. And a lot of that was contingent upon the defense's argument that Stanley Ford did indeed have a brain disorder that caused his impulse control to be weakened. And that's what caused him to set these fires. And so it only takes one. That's all you needed. I want you to know that the jury gave the recommendation, but ultimately it was up to the judge in this case. And on October 26, 2021, the judge, after hearing the victims' impact statements from each family, which I have to say and highlight here that for the Boggs Huggins family, I heard their victim impact statement and it was powerful. They talked about how their brother, Dennis, was not the perfect person, but he didn't deserve to die in that manner, how he was very diligent in trying to take care of his family. That was his main concern, his wife and his family. However, they forgave Stanley Ford openly in court and said that they don't hold any ill will against him. And I always think that is particularly powerful from victims' families to have the perspective of forgiveness when someone viciously murdered their family members. And after hearing those victim impact statements, the judge spoke to how that really gave her a full understanding of the victims, much more than what she knew and what was presented during trial, because oftentimes we're able to just see a snapshot in trial or when we hear stories and episodes that we present on Murder in the Black. But she spoke to the effectiveness of each of the victim impact statements that were read in court that day. And ultimately, she followed the recommendation from the jury and imposed 9 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus additional prison time for the remaining arson-related convictions. In a rare and symbolic sentencing measure, the judge also ordered that Ford be placed in solitary confinement on the anniversaries of the fires and on the birthdays of each child who died, ensuring those dates would be marked by isolation rather than anonymity. At the time of sentencing, Stanley Ford was 62 years old, bringing a formal close to a case that confirmed the fires were deliberate acts intended to kill and devastated an Akron neighborhood. What makes this case difficult to sit with isn't just the violence, but the choice behind it. Fire creates space between the person who acts and the people who are harmed. And that space allows something dangerous to happen. It allows responsibility to feel abstract. There's no confrontation, no exchange, no moment where humanity of another person has to be acknowledged. Instead, there's planning, distance, and timing. When someone uses a gun or a knife, there is proximity, physical closeness that forces a recognition, however brief, that another person is there. Fire removes that requirement entirely. It lets harm unfold without presence, without witness, without interruption. The act is finished before the consequences are fully visible. And that matters because it shifts the violence away from impulse and towards intention. Left with here is not a story about loss of control, which was Stanley Ford's defense, but about someone exercising control quietly over time. Fire becomes a way to avoid confrontation while still asserting power, to erase rather than engage. And that raises a harder question than anger ever does. How does a person arrive at the point where eliminating lives feels easier than coexisting with them? This case doesn't ask us to fear strangers. It asks us to think seriously about how unresolved resentment, when reinforced, justified, and left uninterrupted, can harden into something capable of irreversible harm. Now, as we often do on Murder in the Black, I love to ask you guys questions. And in an effort to foster more conversation, I want to do it not just in the comments on Instagram, not just in the comments on Spotify, but I want to create community. And the way that we're doing that is Substack. Now, I get it. I'm asking you to come join me on yet another platform. But I hope that this platform serves as a place where we can all merge. Because let's face it, we have multiple places where we go and interact with others. Now, for some of us, that's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, but let's face it, for some of us, it's none of those. You just listen to us via podcast, and we appreciate it. But I'm asking you to come over to Substack. Come holla at us over there. That's where we can foster engagement from everybody, a place where we can all come together. Now, I've started it and I already have some notes up there for you to enjoy. But after you finish this episode, I already will have a blog set up for you to come and answer these questions. Now, when someone causes harm without direct confrontation, does that change how we think about intention? And does it make the act feel more calculated? Lastly, I want to talk about Stanley Ford and his defense. The question is this: when a defense argues that a brain disorder should lessen punishment, how do we weigh neurological explanation against sustained planning and repeated behavior? And where should accountability ultimately rest? That is the end of our episode for today. I am, as always, curious to know what you think about today's episode. Have you heard it before? And I'm anxious to hear your thoughts. Now, if you simply don't want to join us at Substack, you already know Instagram is where we have most of our conversation in the comments. I want to encourage you guys to like this video if you are enjoying it on YouTube and ask that you subscribe below. Until next time, this is Murder in the Black, and join us next week.